Hi everybody, welcome to today's seminar. So I've just hit broadcast, so while the number of participants increases, we'll just wait a second to get started for everyone to join us. So for everyone who's just joined, we're just going to wait another minute for everyone to join. So we've just hit broadcast, so there's normally a minute or so delay while everyone moves from the waiting room into the actual seminar. So we've got around 30 participants now who are all here. So we'll just wait a couple of minutes longer.
Cool.
So thanks everyone for joining today's seminar, and I hope everyone's staying well. So thanks to Mark McCann, who's organised and planned today's speaker, and of course to Jeremy for giving his time to deliver today's seminar. So for the seminar, we're going to use the Q&A section of Zoom. So you can see down the bottom of your screen, there's the Q&A section. So as you're listening to today's talk, if you have any questions, just add them as we go along. And then at the end of the seminar, Mark and I will keep on top of the questions and then put them to Jeremy towards the end. So I'm going to put myself on mute and hide my camera now, and I'm going to pass over to Mark, who's going to introduce today's speaker.
Okay, thanks very much, John. So welcome everyone for joining us, and also welcome to any of our external collaborators who are joining or who are watching the recording afterwards. It's the second Zoom seminar, and hopefully the technology works all right with us. So the plan A would have been that this was a week-long course taking place in the Mitchell Library, and the plan B is that this would have been the first in a series of webinars, but due to coronavirus, we've had to go for plan C, which is we'll have this initial seminar, and then Jeremy and I are going to look at rearranging a method seminar later in the year, and also looking very closely at developing resources and systems thinking relevant to health and Public Health Scotland. So apologies for the change of plan, but keep an eye out for the bulletin, and also email me or John if you'd like to join our external partners mailing list. So just to introduce Jeremy Hilton. He's a Principal Research Fellow in Complex Systems at Cranfield University at the Defence Academy of the UK, and he leads the MSc in Systems Thinking practice. So Jeremy and his colleague Lorraine first came to the unit just over a year ago, and we've delivered a course, and we've been building up collaboration since then. And in just about every meeting I've been in with Jeremy, I've had an, oh yeah, I never thought of it like that before moment. And I think alongside studying the dynamics of systems and looking at the structure and connectivity within systems, that idea of a change in perspective, that's one of the key elements of, you know, the systems approach. And so Jeremy's certainly an expert in bringing that change in perspective. So again, I will just keep questions to the end, but I mean, we'll keep an eye on the Q&A box, and there's also put your hand up after about 40 minutes of Jeremy giving the talk. So I'll pass over to Jeremy, and I'm just going to mute myself and switch the video off. So Jeremy, over to you.
Well, thanks, John. Thanks, Mark. And hello, everyone. I'm sorry not to be up in Glasgow with you. This is a first for me. I've not done a webinar before. So I'm speaking to a screen. I know there's lots of people out there having sat on webinars. this is what I'm going to cover today. It's coming from my interest and experience, and some of the work that I'm actually doing for my own studies, which is very much in the systems world and looking at how you're joining up methods. But it's taken me into thinking much more about context. I've been reading quite a lot on culture, certainly from Hall and Shine, but also been quite interested in the gender perspective, and that's something that's going to come out later on. And it's really, what is it that drives us to act? And it's something that we've been exploring as our team down in Cranfield. So I think a lot about where I'm coming from with how I think, but overall, I believe we're all acting to make a difference. And I very much have a view that we try and do our best in whatever we do. And what I want to do today is I want to explore some systems concepts. I want to open up this notion of thinking about ourself and other, whatever other is and whatever self is. Some aspects of sense and sense making. And I also want to talk a bit about the iceberg, which came from Hall, but people know it much more from Shine. And it's a translation of beliefs to action through the iceberg metaphor. And really, I'm looking at critical realism because I believe that's probably best reflects how I think and work. And there's two examples I want to bring, which they're quite big and messy, but they'll give you an idea of where I'm coming from when I get there. And time for Q&A or conversation at the end. So the context is quite an interesting one because the empirical side of life is very much based upon finding real data in the world. And the mindset from an empirical or a positivist view is actually we can work with data. It's only data that we can trust. We don't, what we imagine isn't relevant. It's finding real data out there. And either using mathematical modeling techniques or agent-based modeling techniques, we can actually give an indication of the behavior of something. And right now, what's relevant is actually the epidemic of COVID at the moment. It's very much used to form a basis or the scientific basis for decision-making in government. And it's been used quite a lot in the past. So you can go back as far as foot and mouth, coming through swine flu, to more recently to SARS. And in fact, the models mostly being used for COVID-19 were actually developed from the SARS models from some years ago. I'm not having a view on those. They are used for decision-making. They come from a number of organizations. Here's some examples. And I know Mark's telling me that your own center is also looking at virology and modeling that too. And it's an important factor. So I'm not being critical or not having a view. I just want to actually share some thoughts about the context around models. So the context here is the government had to act to address the COVID pandemic, full stop. They're drivers for their responsibility for the UK PLC, but also as being an international stage as well. Evidence-based decision-making is a philosophy and the policy that government's employed for many, many years. And the science basis for decision-making, actually using mathematical models, is what I would call a closed system. You define all the parameters, you're looking at the interactions and the influences and how they play against each other over time to give you an indication of behavior. And you choose those words, an indication of behavior, because some people believe you can actually use it to predict, but I don't think you can. But really, the focus has been what action needs to be taken to minimize deaths and avoid overwhelming the NHS. But from a broader contextual point of view, what's coming out in the news as a reaction to that, and what I don't believe is necessarily within the modeling, though it's in the context they're now having to deal with, is the impact of the no treatment or non-presentation of other health issues, the impact of isolation of over 70s from health and welfare. And very personal, my mum at 88 has had some real issues as a result of this. Suicide rates are increasing, domestic violence is increasing.
Jeremy, sorry to interrupt. Can I just double check if your slide deck is progressing okay on the screen? It looks like that.
Are you on context?
I can only see the introductory slide at the moment.
So it's not progressing. I've moved on from the introductory slide.
Okay, maybe.
I will unshare and share again, shall I?
Sure, please. Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah,
right.
That's it working now. Thanks.
And it's moving. So yeah, that's what I've just been talking to. Thanks, Mark. The impact of businesses closing, furlough, and actually that society is an open system. And it's very difficult. It's far too complex to model. But the challenge you've got is when the current evidence-based decision making is by modeling the COVID pandemic and behaviors and policy decisions on lockdown or what have you, and those being played in the models to see how it impacts on the behavior of the COVID, but also not overwhelming the NHS. One has to ask the question is what and how have they included these broader contextual factors, which may or may not be more important. We might never know. So I'm not commenting any of the decisions, but merely saying that the COVID pandemic sits within a broader context, which is also relevant for the health and well-being of UK PLC. So I want to just cover some basic systems concepts, and I shall bring those together later on in the talk. The first one I want to cover is that of structural coupling. Anybody who's actually thought about or been involved in complex adaptive systems, this is an essential part of that, is that you take a system, and the system could be MRC, your centre in Glasgow, it could be the system of decision making in the government, either in one of the departments or what have you, but we could take the system here in terms of the system managing the COVID pandemic. It's sitting in an environment. What happens with the system, it will make connections. So as an individual, as a system, we have to eat, we have to sustain ourselves, we have various parameters we need in terms of food, light, and heat, and what have you. But take a government as a system. You know, a government will be acting to stay in power. It's about keeping themselves in being. There's a word, homeostasis is about maintaining self within regulatory boundaries. And there's a term called autopoiesis, which is about maintaining a self in being, and it's very much for living animals, but also is relevant for organizations too. And what happens is the environment changes, then the system is likely to respond. It's structurally coupled. If it doesn't, the chances are it's not going to survive. So that when we look at an organization or a system in context, so we've got the response to the COVID pandemic, the context changes outside in which hopefully the number of infections going down, deaths going down, there's an interaction between that. They're getting feedback on the change. They make some changes. We've just had those yesterday, I think, in Scotland and England and Wales in terms of the decision making by the government, how they're going to manage the COVID. They've changed the system. We're now going to see through the system and context interaction how the system reacts to that from society. They will sense the outcome of their decisions, decide whether to change them. We may change back. We may actually increase unlocking as a result of the behaviors, and work out, remember what worked and what didn't. And then this is constantly ongoing, sensing change, there's variations in the system, in the controls, get the feedback, and we continue to select from past or new ideas, and you adopt or discard them. Interestingly though, again, when we're making decisions and making sense of situations, and some work done by Lorraine Dodd and Anthony Alston, we're looking very much at how open-minded we are and how open-eyed or closed-eyed we are. Can we see or sense what's going on? An example we use quite a lot is the banking crash some time ago, and the bottom left, closed mind, closed eyes. Very much the banks had their models, behavior, they had their indicators. A lot of organizations have the same. And they will believe that they got predictive models and they can make strategic plans as a result of that. So when something out of their belief system arrives, they just may not see it. And this is the notion behind the notion of a black swan. It's something that's outside your belief system. So if one was there, you wouldn't see it. But you may, as they did, they see the crash as out of model events, but they might say, well, it might be black, but we'll just treat it like a white swan. And interestingly, very few of the banks actually changed their models. I know some that did, and we've had conversations with them. But in terms of maintaining control of their system, they will often have their indicators and their models to give a certain amount of comfort and a basis for decision making. Up at the top left, there are people who have to be open-minded, but often their eyes are closed to them, and that might be fire service, for example. When they're going into a big fire, they're not quite sure what they're going to come across. They've got their senses absolutely wildly open, their minds open, but often with smoke and what's going on, they can't see what's going on. And Lorraine developed this having worked with bomb disposal people quite a lot and dealing with IEDs, and it's a very scary place to be. But really what we're saying here is it's trying to constantly work to open your minds to those outside your belief system, the things that might surprise you. and to be thinking from different perspectives. Can we adopt different points of view? Does that help us look at some things differently to give us different options? So again, that's another systems concept to be mindful of. Decision making itself is always made in a context, but often if you've got collaborative decision making, we may or may not all be coming from the same context because we have our own beliefs and values and assumptions and experience and knowledge. And often from all that's out there, we will only notice what interests us or we have experience of, and those sit within our own personal belief system. And if there's things outside that we may not even think of doing, and it's something that happens to me on a daily basis. And I'm going to introduce this notion of sort of gender perspectives too, because one of the most difficult perspectives to see is that from a gender point of view, because we are fairly firmly rooted in a male gender view since the days of Aristotle and Socrates, certainly in the Western world. And that's often been rooted into the ways we think and work. And I'm going to come back to that later on. We have means available, and those are usually come from our systems and structures and competencies. And what this diagram is showing you is that actually often in any particular context there's a variety of options. What the variables are is how constrained or free we are to choose those options, but also what's our drive to act. And that can open up and close down those like a pair of scissors in a way. If our drive's very strong, it might open up and have us consider options which might be unpalatable in some circumstances. And likewise, we may be constrained by the system or others, or opened up and given freedom of action. And it might be our own personal beliefs that actually put constraints on us. So the variety of options are quite personal to self or personal to an organization. And I'm going to come back to this later on. Okay, so far. One of the fundamental points about systems thinking is that of considering the boundary of the system you're thinking about. And I hate using this word system. This system from a concept or system might be a particular black box. It could be an artificial intelligence decision-making system. It could be a mechanical system, or it could be something as conceptual as the health system or an education system. One of the first things one needs to do with collaborative working in systems is actually to surface. What do we take the system to be? What do we think's inside and outside it? What are the boundaries? Can we draw out the various perspectives, relationships, and tensions that we believe to be inside or outside the system? And it gives us that starting point for consensus, or at least beginning to hear and understand how we each see the world and how we can build this picture together, to build the context that we're sitting within. And what we need to try and surface is the choices we're making when we draw this boundary, what's inside and outside. And actually underpinning a lot of this is sometimes it's the information available, often driven by our values and beliefs, and how we perceive the needs and purpose perspective of the problem. It isn't easy to do, and we often are not allowed to have the time to have these conversations, or often we don't give it the time to have these conversations. And we've had some great conversations in Glasgow on the course last year, and I was looking forward to more this year when we're looking at whether it's alcoholism or the use of open spaces and some of the other problems we looked at. And it's surfacing the mental models of the individuals involved in the conversation and trying to hear new insights and hear new knowledge and recognize that we don't think the same way. Others have other knowledge, experience to add, and we need to try and incorporate that from a group point of view. Are the slides changing, Mark? I'm sure you'll tell me if they're not. That's great.
Yep. Yeah, all seems fine, thanks.
Great. So another concept which we found really quite helpful to think about is that of the iceberg. The notion of this sort of iceberg, it seems quite common in the systems world. And I went looking back for its origins. The concepts come from Edward Hall, but it's Edgar Schein who's really credited with this notion of the iceberg. And it's very much talking about there's parts that are visible, the artifacts that you can see. You can see action, observable actions, there's stuff that's documented, structures that are available. What you hear in terms of language, the stories people tell, and stuff that's put out that can be read and seen by others. But sitting below the surface, and often what leads to those artifacts, are sort of espoused values. And that may not necessarily link to the actual behavior that's being undertaken, going back to that sort of drive and order for the choices we make. But there are sort of underpinning spoken or unspoken strategies, goals, rules. So an example of this is you are outside an organization, you're looking into it and helping them think about it. What you won't really know is how that organization is working. There's examples where we're trying to, some interventions, whether it's in health or well-being. We get ideas, whether it's looking at sort of farming in Africa. There's an example of some Italian charities wanted to help farming in Africa, but because they didn't actually understand the ways of working and some of the values there, the propositions they made weren't actually particularly helpful. And right at the basis of this, what's really driving are these underlying values, beliefs, and assumptions that we all carry, but they also work within organizations as well. And these are the unspoken rules, the unconscious beliefs, the ways of working, ways of thinking, that if you're not of the organization or of that community, you won't understand them necessarily. Another example of this would be when I was in Cardiff, looking at how the police were trying to determine where to put police patrols in certain areas of South Wales and the Cardiff area, understanding the community boundaries, which often there is tension. And they ended up having to talk to the communities, and the communities would tell them where the boundaries were because they couldn't observe them from outside. They weren't visible to the police, but they needed to understand those. So they had to engage to try and find out what's going on. So I'm going to take this and run with this metaphor for a bit, but the final sort of concept I want to bring with is this aspect of this notion of self and other. It's quite a philosophical view, and there's two aspects I want to bring into that. And certainly when we're talking about causality and causing action, Andras Anyal, who's a psychiatrist, would argue that we can only interact with the environment we sit within. We can't directly interact with another person, From that point of view, what I say, and I could be having an argument with my children, doesn't matter, I could say something, they might appear to respond to what I say and appear to do what I want them to do. And I could say, well, I cause them to do that. But actually what I don't know is what they heard in what I said. And NLP is actually quite an interesting concept to think about here. How did they receive what I said? How do they take that into what they already knew? How do they take that into their whole value system, what interested them and what their sort of intentions were? They will then act. But I might perceive a correlation between what I said and how they act, but I don't believe I can interact directly. And I use this as quite an interesting way of exploring systems problems. And certainly if you're looking to make policy decisions and expect actions to be taken, it's something worth considering, that I can put information out there. And as a lecturer, I ask questions of students, not to find out, catch them out, but to determine whether they've heard and taken on board what I said in the sense that I want it to be understood. And you often need a conversation for that. I can't just deliver it. There's a structural coupling between the self and the environment. And part of this notion of identity is what distinguishes myself from the environment. What is it that distinguishes me or my organization or this system? We have a very strong driver to maintain our identity, and we'll often interact to maintain ourselves within our environment. But the environment is constantly changing, and this is the structural coupling aspect, that it produces perturbations, and we may then interact with it to maintain ourselves. And we're thinking about the self as government and in the environment they're in. It's a very challenging environment at the moment, or any particular entity. There's this constant dance going on. It's never static, and therefore it's quite difficult to see what's going on from the outside, and even more difficult to try and model the behaviors. So we start bringing this together, and what I'm trying to start to build a picture here of is how underpinning beliefs and values, which are the ones very, very firmly rooted within ourselves as individuals, but also within organizations and cultures, will foster mental models and culture. And this will constitute the identity, which has got this interaction with its environment. The heteronymous action at the top of the screen is the word Andres Anyal brought to determine the fact that the environment doesn't like being done to. There are others in the environment who will often push back against what you choose to do. So self doesn't have freedom of action when it's interacting to maintain itself. There's heteronymous pushback from the environment, from other people, existing systems and structures that are out there. But the self, the organization, or the individual will often maintain itself through the arrangement of components leading to its systemic structures, which is why on the outside, two organizations apparently doing the same thing internally may be working very differently, because their internal systemic structures will be leading and coming from the values and beliefs. And there's that implicit link between mental models and culture and the systemic structures. But really it comes through this notion of maintaining self and the identity. The structures will to a certain extent determine the patterns of behavior, and it's those that gives rise to the visible events and actions that we see at the top of the pyramid. Now these actions might be pure human action, I'll go for a walk. It might be human action supported with technology. I might be driving a car, I might be using an IT system, I might be in a ventilator, or it might be pure technology. And here I'm really looking at artificial intelligence and automated decision making. And it's through these which we would interact with the environment. Pulling out on the left-hand side, though, it's those, to a certain extent, part of the visible events and actions are how we strive to achieve coordination of actions to improve, you know, the environment or the environments out there. But a very important factor, which I believe, which has come out, is that we often express our mental models and culture, and they're often constructed through the language we use, and it's that language which coordinates the coordination of action. And I think this language is a hugely important hidden structure, and so it is sitting with systemic structures, and it's not just talking the language of Urdu or English or Swahili. It's actually the language of a businessman, somebody who's in the health environment, somebody who's in finance or engineering or IT, because domain language itself is quite challenging. And certainly, and I've had conversations with Mark and others, is how do I try and express notions of systems and systems thinking without using the language of systems thinking? George Spencer Brown, in his book some time ago, which is what I picked up on, was saying, how do you introduce the concept of mathematics to somebody who has no concept of mathematics? So you don't have the language of mathematics available to you. So you have to build this language with them. And this aspect of language is often one of the things that confuses and causes immense problems, because we often don't get the time to push through and have the conversation to make sure we're understanding. I'm using the word this way. Do you use it in the same sense? So that language aspect is an important factor. Another way of looking at the beliefs and values is actually looking at some of the embedded aspects of gender. And there's a book I've been reading recently called Invisible Women, so I just had to check it then, which got me thinking about this, and there's some good examples. One being ice clearing in Sweden. There's a town in Sweden was actually rethinking its policies with a gendered bias and said, well, why do we always sweep the roads in the morning for the traffic, when actually it's often the males driving the cars to go to work and they drive in the morning, come home in the evening. And it's often the partners, generally the females, who might be taking kids to school, they might be doing shopping, dealing with aged relatives, and going to work themselves. So if we actually look to get the pavements cleared first, cars can drive through an inch or two of snow. It's not a problem. We can then do the roads later on. What they hadn't perceived was the benefits that came from clearing the pavements. It reduced the number of slips and trips and therefore accidents, massively reduced intake to A&E, which also had a positive impact on less time taken off work, and therefore from an economic point of view there were huge benefits. And it was really quite a surprise. So to question what are our underpinning drivers and looking at it, and there are many examples, and I think certainly in the course I'm starting in September, it's something, a notion I want to make sure is considered, this aspect of gender bias, which is so deeply rooted in both male and female. I think it needs to be surfaced. So let's put it all together. Here's the iceberg: beliefs and values, fostering the mental models. We've got the decision-making side of life. do we have a drive to act, affects acceptable choice within the variety, we have a means of action, and we have the order that constrains or opens it up. And I'd be interested in your thoughts, because it's the first time I sort of publicly expressed this whole picture. So our underpinning beliefs and values may initiate human action, but also the environment, this pushback, will affect our beliefs and values, because you've got this structural coupling going on. We don't sit alone, we're constantly in this dance. The beliefs and values provide the basis for our drive to act, even though the environment can provide a drive to act. But the options we've got might influence our beliefs and values, especially if we're working with others who might have a different drive and a different variety of options. But we design our social structures according to our beliefs and values and cultures. And moving into technology, the world of process networks and algorithms are often designed according to our beliefs and values. And I touch on this one, but again, from a gender point of view, time was, back in the 60s and 70s, most programming of computing was done by women. It was seen as an administrative sort of secretarial task. I think in the early 70s, when some of the early small computers came in, they're seen as toys for the boys, and it became very much a male programming environment, became a male focus. More recently, in terms of the design of computing, and organizations are now structured around the computer networks and systems that we have. There's very little choice of an organization to determine its structure, because it's driven by the technology and the suppliers of technology. But increasingly, there was thoughts within Amazon or Google that, hey, we're hiring lots of people. Let's use artificial intelligence to sift through all our applications. And what surprised them is, even though they had a great variety of excellent applications from different ethnic backgrounds and different genders and age ranges, funnily enough, the majority of the ones successfully selected were young white males. And they recognized there's a problem here. And the problem here was actually the data that the algorithms were learning on. They didn't actually have enough data, gender segregated, racially segregated, age segregated data that they can actually train the algorithms. And a lot of these algorithms, sweeping statement, are beginning to drive decision-making and organizational structures and how we model things. And there's a real sort of exclamation, a real warning there of, actually, we have to consider the training data. In those organizations, they went back to manual selection and manual sifting of CVs. The same has happened in sentencing in the American criminal courts, and there are more and more examples appearing of the bias embedded within artificial intelligence. So moving up, and certainly for those who ever work in the cyber field, is trying to bring together the cognitive, the virtual and physical together. So this virtual space of organizational structures, time was, they have placed requirements on the computer systems and other technology we use. But increasingly, the technology is constraining and shaping our social structures. And as you can see how this joins up, we might design social structures and technology to come together to give us the ability to act, supported by technology. But also, you've got this autonomous action of autonomous vehicles now, or of artificial intelligence in decision-making. And I just sort of put it out there as a question mark around it. How does it all join up? How does it impact the degree of order? How does it impact the drive to act, and what means of actions does it provide? So, agency and structure is a conversation itself. It's something that has actually emerged in the world of critical realism. We'll come into that in a bit. But essentially, the structures we live within, and that the structure includes language as well as organizational structure, cultural ways of working, and the technologies have at play, has a major influence on the agency, the opportunities, and the agency in terms of our order and the options that we can select, and the ability to do and add value wherever we go. So this, again, this relationship between agency and structure is an important one. Even coming back to government decision making, the structures around government and the separation of the various departments, and the focus very much from the health point of view, but you've got differing heads of departments who would be responsible for business or overseas travel or what have you. Where do they come together? as a system are they joined up, because each of them will have different beliefs and values driving each of the government departments. And again, when you start enacting policy, who else is involved? So there are a lot of hidden structures which can have an impact on agents, the ability to act and act for a common purpose. So bringing together empiricism, realism, critical realism, let's just tease this about a bit. Evidence-based policy, a lot of Ray Pawson's work has looked at this. And he's arguing that the pure empirical modeling, the empiricism, the realistic perspective of just purely using data, doesn't necessarily help you understand what's going on. It'll describe what's happening, describe the dynamics, but may not give you an understanding. And he'll argue that you need to have context available, an understanding of context. The outcome patterns are descriptive. They're the ones that make science perk up and take notice, in his words. And bearing in mind that usually behind this, whether it's an engineering or management point of view, there's a desire to seek control. So we want to have mechanisms in place to control those. And they're what he calls the engines of explanation from a realist point of view. They're telling the mechanisms tell us what interconnection should occur. Mechanisms explain the causal relations, which leads to the outcomes. The outcome patterns, though, are very much contingent on the context and what's relevant in the context. And on the left, they're his words, they're quotes, saying just by gathering data is not necessarily going to give us an understanding of the why. It's not going to give an explanation, but it might help us where to look. And that you need to have this context and understanding of a realist perspective, that you can't just run with data. But I think there's a very strong synergy between the two. And the other point he brings out, which is an interesting one, and I mentioned it earlier on, is that the government on the left has identified a problem, it's interpreting it, and actually it's determining policy. But others are acting out that policy, here shown by Agent 2, which may carry it out properly, or there may be a miscarriage of the policy, especially if you get a long chain. And then there's a subject who are being done to. Their response or resistance is an important part. And certainly listening to the news of the last few days and the reaction to yesterday and today is how will society respond to the changes in government policy as a result of the change in the context, going back to my earlier structural coupling model. They're adjusting the system for dealing with this and exploring what the reaction is. And it's going through this chain where there's multiple bodies. Each one of those has their own beliefs and values and drives and desires to act and order and so on. So there's this dance going on. So I showed one particular view, but actually people are coming together in that environmental interaction. So critical realism, and this to me is a summary slide of trying to pull together what positioning the empirical, the realist perspective against the positivist view, the empirical view, against the overall critical realism. At the center, there are events that are actually observed and experienced, but they sit within what Bhaskar would call an actual environment, where events and non-events that are going on and generated, and sitting in this whole sea are the mechanisms and structures with enduring properties. And these are multifaceted, multi-perspective, they are constantly interacting. They're given shape when we think about them, we give them shape. And it's the whole of reality that's going on. And it's recognizing that reality exists, whether we think about it or not. The actual, to a certain extent, is what we might bring together. And they might be the ones that are observed. Pawson has a view of critical realism, and he only refers to realism because his view is that the critical nature of critical realism is bringing an individual perspective to it. Whereas I believe with collaborative thinking and systems thinking, the critical aspects of the choices around realism are the boundary conversations of what you're choosing to observe, put inside or outside the system, and is done in a collaborative way, and trying to incorporate all those parties who might have a view, and recognizing that you will be aspects you're going to be missing. You need to sweep in as many perspectives as are relevant, as are helpful, But within that, there are aspects where you want some specific, detailed, data-based understanding to help describe behavior and give an indication of behavior over time. And for me, that's where the empirical sits within a critical realist perspective. So from my point of view, as a systems thinker, critical realism tends to reflect, for me, my philosophy best, recognizing there are some systems methods, very much empirical ones, and there are others that help you interpret and draw together aspects of the actual sitting within this real perspective Bhaskar talks to. I want to try and now just finish off with a couple of examples very quickly. There's two case studies. They're quite frightening diagrams, but please don't be frightened by them. You can have a look at them later on. One of them has come very much from the American Special Forces work out in Afghan. This has been ridiculed as a complex diagram. If I were to say that this actually, for McChrystal's headquarters, very much reflected their collective understanding of the relationship of what's going on, the different aspects of what's going on, to try and help them pull together an understanding of or describe the behavior that's going on. And he used that as a basis of the context for mission planning. Whether you agree with it or not, I'm not going there. But in terms of an organization coming together to have a common basis for working and to try and avoid surprises, that if they acted on one part, they wouldn't be surprised by a reaction elsewhere that they hadn't considered. This, to me, equates to the actual, that central part within critical realism, within which you can have some empirical views or do some specific planning on certain actual, actual is the wrong word, so certain specific empirical actions you want to take. Constantly updated, and this became the model of understanding within the headquarters. But they also recognized that they didn't understand the whole picture. There was still other stuff going on that they didn't understand. So another example was in an organizational change of a large government department. And this is where, for those that think of an interpretive stance, so with a very much a a check and soft systems view of trying to gain some insight and interpret from the data what's going on. The way I've approached the use of soft systems methodology is to produce some conceptual models based upon, what were we trying to achieve? What would we be looking for? How do we focus our thinking to start pulling out of what Bhaskar critical realism, look at the actual, that we bring to bear, bring to focus such that we can act on it. So following his scary diagram coming up, this is a conceptual model of an organization based upon understanding what the organization is trying to achieve, what standards it wants to comply with, what's its current ways of working. And we structured it not by looking at the organization and modeling it through data of the organization, but developing a conceptual model based on purpose. And this helped to say, well, I expect these things are going on, and you could then use this as a lens to explore specifics. And you could explore specific parts of an organization, not having to deal with the whole. And you're not spending days modeling a whole organization. And alongside that, to try and get a view of the dynamics, over time we built this view coming in from the broader context from the government department, its area of interest, but then looking inside the organization. Again, a scary spaghetti diagram, but suffice to say that this was trying to understand how the organization from a dynamic point of view came together, such that you can deal with one part, but understand its interactions with other parts of the organization. And when you're starting to think in terms of measures of performance and metrics, they had a very much a downstream, a lagging measure of customer satisfaction. And I was trying to get them to think about, well, if you get stuff right upstream, you're more likely to get a better outcome downstream. And this type of thinking, and again, it reflects the actual, from a Bhaskar critical realist point of view, it's a conceptual point of view. We believe this might be some of the behaviors going on within which we want to take a specific view. So in terms of managing performance in the organization, we could use that thinking to work out what are the key questions for delivery. And using the analysis of the conceptual model of this one bottom left, we can say, well, what questions do we want to ask? What information do we need to have? Find the right process. And then that helps us determine and identify quality criteria measures. This is now how I'm starting to understand from an empirical point of view, for real world data, what is relevant, what will help us manage the performance of this system. So what do I need to include in my empirical models to determine behavior over time? So this is now firmly linking the empirical aspect into the actual, into the context. And we can then use that for identifying the important processes, roles, job descriptions, and also more specifically, what measures of performance and metrics, very much in the empirical space now, and we can model this, as will give us an indication of good behavior. So when we're now looking at policy decisions within the organization, and this is applicable elsewhere too, what data do we need to include in our model? It helps us better understand the scope of the empirical models that will add value in certain parts of our thinking from a systems thinking point of view. So that is the equivalent. So it's rooted in the agreed purpose of the organization. It's conceptual thinking, and it's a context for organizational change. A common frame of reference so people could find where they fitted in the organization. And again, it accepts there are other unknown mechanisms and structures with enduring properties. So just to come to a conclusion now, putting empiricism in context, I repeat, it's not either or, but it's both. And it's not pragmatism from a philosophical point of view, but critical realism. It's recognizing the interplay between self and other, and it's this structural coupling which is really important depending on what self or system is. It's making sure that when we're generating models, they are actually also involve surfacing beliefs, values, mental models, and drivers at play of the various communities involved in what it is we're trying to model. The interventions are purposeful activities. They have unintended consequences and benefits as well as the ones we're seeking. Exploring boundaries with regard to context is absolutely essential. But also you need the empirical models because understanding potential behavior over time is a key for policy decisions. And rather than playing with real people on policy decisions, if we can test them on models first, there's immense value to tune them and get them right beforehand. So my concluding slide is this one. There we go.
Great, thank you very much for that, Jeremy. Normally at this stage there'd be a round of applause, but because everyone is muted, you can't hear it, but I can assure you it's there. And thank you very much. Really interesting range of concepts and ideas, and I can certainly see there's a lot of relevance for how we design health interventions and certainly work with co-creating understandings of social systems related to health. Just open it up and see if anyone has some questions. I'm just going to zip over. Can I ask everyone to raise their hand if they'd like to be unmuted, or you can type into the Q&A as well.
We have one question in the Q&A, Mark.
Sure. Let's see, I can read this out. I don't know if someone would like to raise their hand to speak, but I'll just read it out here. So while I agree with system perspectives, it seems that it sometimes presents itself as value-free, omitting the observer. But of course, Bhaskar and Varela Maturana structural coupling both did not take this position. Indeed, the former was very much about a critical sociology.
Yes, for me, the philosophical view is does the observer stand outside the system? And a lot of the empirical models and the positivist view has had the perspective, amongst some of them, that the observer is outside the system and is trying to model the system. My philosophical view is that as soon as you are connected, you interact with the system, you become part of it. And therefore you have to take into account the influence you might have on that situation, especially if you're going into an organization or personally involved within a decision or stuff like that. And yes, Bhaskar and very much over Bhaskar is, And his aspect of critical realism was the fact that he was recognizing the observer's perspective. The challenge is when you're working collaboratively is to surface the perspective as a starting point and then recognizing the potential impact you've got. But I also believe that actually I come from a perspective that no one can tell another what to do. And I think systems thinking can help people think through their own problems. So everybody's an observer in that. But the context that people are sitting within, if they're living within it, you want to help them think about it whilst recognizing that you can't stand apart from it.
Okay. Thank you. I've just seen Alice has a question. I've unmuted. I think you need to unmute yourself, Alice, to ask the question. Let me. I'm just having some difficulties. Alice, did you have a question? Or John, are you able to unmute Alice?
I've tried to click allow to talk. It doesn't seem to be working for me either. Maybe Alice's microphone isn't switched on.
Okay, we'll see if Alice reconnects in a minute. We'll try again. Okay, another question has come up here. If I understood correctly, understanding a system requires working with individuals in the system. Is it difficult to strike a balance between the bias from participants existing within this system and the need to use co-production like methods in order to provide a comprehensive understanding?
That is such a great question. You put your finger right on the nub of the challenge of collaborative working. There's some great work done by the Dialogue Project out of MIT, which again, if you want to look into this more, and it's about providing a safe space where people feel comfortable actually to recognize and express their differing views without others being critical of them. And part of the facilitation of these collaborative efforts is to try and enable people to feel free to talk about their views. And we use techniques such as rich picturing and other techniques, cognitive mapping, that people can then start building this collaborative picture and spark off each other. And it's sometimes it's setting ground rules. And I've had some interesting situations where there might have been a bit of tension. And if there is an unspoken elephant in the room, sometimes as a facilitator, you have to point to it in a way that enables people to actually feel free to express views. But it's starting off, and we might try some aspects of thinking, working together, to where people recognize that they think differently. And sometimes it comes out partway through a day or into a second day when they suddenly realize they've assuming the way they think is the way everybody thinks. And for me, that is actually a great threshold to cross. It's a difficult one to cross when you suddenly recognize, hang on, there's stuff here I don't know. Somebody else is looking at this differently. And it's not that they're wrong or you're wrong. It's you both have a different view. You have an interest in different things and therefore see it differently. And yeah, that is quite a challenge, and it depends on how people come together to want to work together.
Okay, thanks. I have another question here. So thanks, this was a fantastic presentation. When designing interventions, we should first try to learn about the context. How should we go about that in terms of methodological choices to first understand the system? Would qualitative research approaches go better here, considering quantitative items might, lead themes or kind of predetermine?
I would, yes, because there are qualitative aspects. There's the quantitative method. So for me, it's starting off with quite soft qualitative approaches. So we have various tools and techniques such as producing rich pictures, generating diagrams. When you look in the middle of what you got control over, the next level out, what can you influence, what are your constraints? Cognitive mapping of what do you, in an unstructured way, think relationship between things are, what leads to what leads to what, to try and surface different views. And it's trying to generate that boundary conversation. Now, thinking in terms of quantitative modeling, system dynamics, then moving into cognitive maps, into generating causal loop models is a step towards that. And you're increasing a focus on one or a range of issues. Or it may be from the qualitative point of view, you start generating a range of root definitions. Yeah, does this reflect the situation? Does this reflect the situation? And trying to gently step into some aspect of accommodation, if not consensus. And it's about trying to spend some time surfacing, trying to paint a picture of the landscape, almost metaphorically and almost literally, to try and, what are the challenges? What's emerging? What do people bring to bear? What are people noticing? And then it's when you have more of a focus in certain areas, I think you will then go into the quantitative aspects. When there's something you want to understand the behavior of better, but it's about the boundary conversation and how you would bound the quantitative item within that sort of qualitative landscape. And certainly for us, something like CSH, critical systems heuristics, is a great way of thinking through developing a range of models from different perspectives, because critical systems heuristics, I find, really does bring out, well, those being done to, those who don't have a voice, and some of the ethical and moral aspects of the interventions you're planning. So it's problem focused, it's contextual. If there's a very specific question you're being asked to address, there's nothing to stop you going straight to a quantitative view. But I think you need to sweep out into context just to check those aspects you're building into it, and also being aware of what you're excluding. So I don't know if that helps as an answer.
And I'd like to follow up on that to say that a lot of the methods that you mentioned there about creating models and co-production and having collaborative workshops to do that, we're planning on having Jeremy and Lorraine and others to come up to Glasgow to deliver more of that training and talk through some of those methods in more detail. Any other questions? You can see we're just coming to time now. I'm just going to try unmuting Danny. Okay, can you unmute yourself at your end, Danny?
Hello, can you hear me?
Hi, Danny. Yeah.
Hi, thanks very much. That's really interesting, Jeremy, and lots of ideas to ponder over. I was struck by how your discussion about the role of the individual and the extent of the individual agency seemed to be very much in keeping with my understanding of Tony Giddens' notion of structuration. And I was also struck by how your discussion of language and the importance of language as a key structure, and not, as you say, not one language versus another language in terms of Urdu versus French, but within languages, the common understandings of, say, banker's language or businessman's language seem to be basically talking about what sociologists call discourse, and again drawing on Foucault's ideas of discourse. So my question was, in your thinking about this, have you drawn on those now quite well old established classical sociological theories from Foucault and Giddens?
No, I haven't actually, Danny, and thanks. I need to go and look at that. I've come from, I'm an engineer originally, and I've come in through a systems engineering into systems thinking and into culture from that point of view. And the recognition of our personal biases and how, and the other factor is working with colleagues around decision making. So I've not actually come in from a social science point of view from Tony Giddens or Foucault. But I think I need to, because within there's a systems thinking mastership we're launching, and one of the factors, which is a really important one, is dialogue and collaboration, and how you structure facilitated workshops which lead to that aspect of discourse, and how you enable people to better understand each other. So that could be quite helpful without me going into too much depth. We have another systems model called the viable systems model we use, and that has you very much focus on the lines between, it's a functional management sort of decomposition. But in the lines, Stafford Beer very much talks about channel capacity. And the channel capacity on these lines of communication is not just bandwidth from an electronic point of view, it's the capacity of the individual to receive and understand. And he talks of attenuation, where there's a limiter. Either you hear what you want to hear, or some stuff you don't understand or is not of interest.
Yeah.
An amplification the other way. But he also very clearly says that when you are sending out a message information, you must put it in the language of the recipient. And also you must be prepared to translate it back when you receive them. Don't expect them to put it in your language. And it's the first time from a systems methods point of view that somebody specifically talked about this notion of translation and being aware of the different language. So I will look at Foucault.
Sounds like you're getting a lot more into how you actually operationalize these high-level sociological theories, which is hugely necessary.
Yeah.
And so it's really valuable to be taking it further.
Thank you. And any guidance and ideas and support will be gratefully received. I'm really disappointed they can't be out there this week, because we can have these conversations face to face around the context of your problems, which would help me better understand. I came across it recently when I was helping my partner, who's a finance director of a housing association, and they have an issue around an IT systems upgrade. And I've got a background in that, but trying to find a way to express the issues I felt they were perceiving in a language that she as finance director or the senior leadership team or the board of directors could understand is hugely difficult for that very reason. So it's something for me to explore. So I'd be grateful to hear any other thoughts and recommendations, suggestions, please.
Good. All right, thanks very much for that question, Danny. I think it really is a shame that circumstances are as they are, but we're definitely going to try and arrange some follow-up courses in person in Glasgow, and possibly some online resources as well. I think that's us to time, and I don't see any other questions. So once again, thanks very much, John, for organising, and Jeremy for agreeing to speak. And thanks all for joining. If you have any other questions or comments, please email or get in touch with us afterwards. And I'll see you at the next seminar. Okay, thanks everyone.